Well, here we are in creation season, which is why I'm wearing this lovely orange stole that was given to me as a present. I think all of my stoles came to me that way. But creation season is a special season in the United Church of Canada. It was actually created by one of our former moderators. His name escapes me at the moment. And I think it's really wonderful that we take some time to acknowledge creation. Now, suppose, just for a moment, that a stranger came walking in through the back of the church there and said that they were going to preach today. How would that feel? What would we say? Would we say, well, who are you? Who do you think you are? What gives you the right to barge in like this? Okay. Now hold on to those feelings of discomfort and even a little bit of being offended. Think of how that would feel. Okay. Now I think that helps us understand what the chief priests felt like when Jesus barged into the temple. Now try to imagine another scenario. Imagine that you are involved in the leadership of a very large project, maybe something the size of the International Plowing Match. Were any of you involved in that? Some of you? Oh, okay. Well, you know how many people. There were hundreds of thousands of people who committed everything they have. So imagine you're in a similar situation. You're involved in this huge project, but now you're not so sure about the leadership. They don't seem to know where they're going, and you hear people beginning to murmur about replacing the CEO, and you become one of the dissenters. Can you feel how uneasy that would feel? Have you signed up for something that you didn't expect? Okay, that's how the Hebrew people were beginning to feel about Moses in our reading from Exodus today. They've given everything they have to this venture. They've brought their families, their herds, their livestock. It wasn't just a few people. It was a massive number of people that were on the move. And now they've hit a roadblock. Okay, and it's interesting that this kept happening to them because, wandering for 40 years in that area doesn't seem to make a lot of sense because it actually takes, even when you account for the breaks, it would be 47 days to make that trip. But I think the reason they had to keep going and had to keep traveling was they had to learn the lessons that God was giving them along the way. And this is one of those lessons. There is no water. Is it any wonder that they grumbled? Now, when the people of Israel grumble against Moses, they also grumble against God. And they begin to doubt whether this God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is really their God. And this God has not left them. The God has been there as the God in the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke. This is the same God that has fed them with manna and with quails and has even done a miracle sweetening the waters that were bitter. And yet they want to know, hey, what has God done for them lately? Now imagine that you're part of a church and it has leadership in a place far away that doesn't look anything like where you live and work. Now, how can they understand what it's like to work in the fields, not a 9-to-5 job? And what are we getting out of this deal anyways? Now, if you're feeling that sense of resentment, you're not alone. In fact, the church has had conflict, dissension, argument, and disappointment over their leaders since its very beginnings. Philippi, Rome, and Corinth all had their grumblings against what they considered their head office. These churches are not anywhere near Jerusalem. Now, Philippi was a Roman outpost on the edge of the empire in what we now know as Macedonia. So what could Peter, Paul, Silas, Barnabas, Timothy, and Philip, what could they know about life in these outposts? Well, there's something in human nature that leads us to grumbling, to dissension, even rebellion. Because we are the chief priests, we are the dissenters in Philippi, and we are the ones who grumble in the desert. Now, when Moses split the rock in the desert, he named the two parts Massah and Mirebah, meaning testing and arguing. And isn't that like what we are? We are Massah and we are Mirebah. Now, I wonder why Moses took the time to memorialize that place. You know, we usually name the places that we want to remember because they were places of our success. You know, we want to put a plaque up and we want to build a museum or something. We don't go naming things, especially things that are not pleasant. But there is actually a place called Mirebah in Saudi Arabia. And there's a large rock there that is split right down the middle. And people believe that it is the actual rock that Moses struck. You know, you can Google it and you can see it split like that. Now, the story of the splitting of the rock is deeply embedded in Hebrew culture and religion. It is repeated throughout many of the books of what we call the Old Testament. It's mentioned specifically in 5 different Psalms and referred to in an equal number. So this is something deeply ingrained with them. And it's part of this ongoing saga of the Hebrew people when they go from obedience to disobedience and then reconciliation with God. And this happens over and over and over. So that's one reason it took 40 years to get there and to get all of the lessons that they needed to get. And yet every time they are called back to the will of God, it is through a prophet that God has raised up. And those prophets, especially Micah and others through Isaiah and Ezekiel, they keep calling the people back by saying, you need to care for the least of us, the widow, the orphan, the people who are the least in society. That is the way to go back to God, because that is the will of God, and that is what we're called to do. Now, some of you probably were following the story about the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she was a champion of human rights. Rights for women, rights for people who needed a champion at that level. You know, if you're a woman today and you have a bank account, you have a credit card, you can apply for a loan without your husband's signature. Okay, now I know that wasn't in this country, but we followed suit. Anything that happens in America usually happens here. And by championing those rights in her own country, she set up a beacon for others. Now, at her funeral, there's a wonderful rabbi who spoke about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she said that Ruth's motivation for the work that she did was based on her understanding of her Bible. That outreach to the people who were powerless was part of what she understood as being in the Constitution, those words, we the people. And anytime she felt that those people were being excluded, she went to work. Now, in the early church, we didn't have a Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But what we did have was Paul. Now, Paul is the great unifier in the church. He's kind of the fixer. Whenever there was a problem, well, call Paul. And if he couldn't make it there in person, he sent a letter. Now, this time when he's writing to the church in Philippi, they're having a problem. There are things going on. And Paul writes this letter, which contains some of the most beautiful words that we have in Christianity. Be of the same mind as in Christ Jesus. Words that have been actually called a hymn. And he was in prison. He was under a death sentence. He didn't know when or how it might happen, and eventually it did happen. But he was on death row when he penned those words to the church in Philippi. And he appeals to the leadership of this church to become united. Now, that's not the same thing as being unanimous. And that's a good thing. Because we are never going to have the same opinions. And really, that is the strength of our diversity. But the reason that it works for us is because we recognize the leadership of Jesus Christ. No matter who we may have as our leaders in the church, our one true head of the church is Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus himself, he did not exercise the authority of being the Son of God. He laid aside these privileges in order to prove that love is more powerful than death. Now, this is not passivity, but it is a radical form of hospitality that puts others ahead of yourself. And that was why Paul urged the Philippians to put the cares of others before their own. How simple, and yet how hard, even for us today. And we've been challenged to put aside our privileges as white people to see how this affects our view of society and of history. Putting ourselves aside makes room for the other. And this is called radical hospitality. I've been finding myself experiencing this more and more from being in connection and communication with several ministers I know, Black ministers in the United Church of Canada. And they have been my beacon. They have been the people, when I reach out to them and I understand, I hear some of the things that they're feeling this week after the decision not to pursue charges against the police that were involved in the death of Breonna Taylor. They felt hurt, outraged, despair. Now, who am I to deny that experience, to say, well, there's two sides to every story and maybe it was justified, and, on and on and on. They don't need to hear that. What they need to hear is me saying, I'm with you. I hear you. Because in that, you're putting aside all that other junk that we bring to the conversation as people with privilege and power, and just doing what Jesus did, stripping that all away and just listening as a human being, listening to another, even when it's very, very uncomfortable, probably especially when it's that uncomfortable. Because, Jesus didn't always lead his disciples into comfortable places. More often than not, it wasn't. And when he took his followers with them into the temple, it was an act of civil disobedience. Just before this, he had overturned the tables of the money changers, freeing all the animals. I mean, he caused a big ruckus, okay? And what does he do right after that? He marches into the temple, taking his little ragtag group of people with him, and they occupy the temple. This is a huge risk. He knows he's going to come up right against the authorities, right up against the temple priests. And they come up to him and they ask him, by what liberty do you claim the right to be here? He answers them with a question. And this is a typical rabbinical method. Ask a question and answer with a question. There's a story about a group of students who went to their rabbi and they said, "Why do you always answer a question with a question?" To which the rabbi replied, "Why shouldn't I answer a question with a question?" Now, Jesus poses the question to the priests. Did John's baptism come from heaven or from human beings? Now, the priests know that they're really stuck here. If they say from heaven, then Jesus is going to say, then why didn't you believe John? Why didn't you go out there? But if they say no, it came from human beings, well then, they're in another pickle because they're facing crowds of people who are proclaiming John as a prophet. And not only as a prophet, but the prophet who foretold Jesus. So what do? Well, they just shrug and they say, well, we don't know. And that's a crushing blow for them because they've been the people everyone has looked to for answers. So when they say they don't know, wow. And then Jesus drives the point home by telling them the story about a landowner with 2 sons. Now, this landowner has a vineyard. Now, whenever you hear the term vineyard in the Hebrew Bible or in stories like the ones Jesus are telling, the vineyard stands in for the nation of Israel. Okay, so that's what you need to understand when you're listening to this. So, he tells them about the 2 sons. And the one that said that he would obey and didn't, and then the one who didn't, and then he did. So he asked them, which one did the will of the Father? Now, of course, God's is represented by the Father. So who did the will of God? And this time they think they've got the right answer. It's the son who repented, changed his mind, and did the will of his Father. That's the righteous one. Because they're saying then, we're the righteous ones too. Well, Jesus has led them straight into a trap. If they think they're so righteous, then why haven't they repented? So they're no better than the tax collectors and the prostitutes who have heard the word of God and have repented. Now, a side note here, Jesus did not have a problem with prostitutes and tax collectors. They were, in fact, among his followers, and they might have even been with him there in the temple. Wouldn't that have been a hoot? But the reason that these excluded people were able to receive John's baptism is because it took place outside of the temple. John wasn't part of the established structure of religion, and neither is Jesus. He reached out to people on the margins because, frankly, no one else had ever even tried. They were the people who weren't even expected to be in the temple. They weren't rich enough. They didn't dress right. They, were not the right kind of people. And, sometimes we do that in the church as well. We look at people and wonder, why are they here? What are they doing here? Do they belong? We can choose to be Massah and Mirebah. We can be Philippi. We can be the scribes and the priests of the temple. We can be those who are in the desert, who are quarreling. Or we can choose to hear the call of God on our hearts. Where God leads, God will provide. Now, we might be expected at some of the company that we will keep on that journey. That's okay. We've been called, we've been gathered, and we're being sent into the vineyard to produce a harvest worthy of the kingdom. Praise be to God. Amen.